Welcome to Chapter 32. I'm Mr. Rodman, taking you through Dr. Krugman's looking at labor markets, unemployment, and inflation in this chapter. So glad to have you along. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at the natural rate of unemployment, what that means, why zero is not a true definition of that. We're going to look at cyclical unemployment, frictional unemployment. We'll also look at the minimum wage and efficiency wages, the difference between the two. We'll look at the reasons for unemployment in terms of why it is that sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. It's not just cyclical in nature. We'll also look at short run and long run trade-offs between unemployment and inflation in the short run and how that changes or evaporates in the long run. And then we'll look at NAIRU, this idea of as a policy-making tool in terms of the expectations game. So that's what we're going to take a look at in this chapter. Let's start by looking at the nature of unemployment and what we call the natural rate of unemployment. Now, these numbers that you see that were written are numbers as examples, so kind of ballparks. Typically, frictional unemployment, people between jobs that are looking for new work. Usually about 1% of the unemployment rate is due to frictional unemployment. People are just in between jobs looking for that next big job. And so that's pretty minor in comparison. Only when they can't find work because their skills are insufficient, leads to the structural unemployment issue. And this is either jobs aren't available or they need to be retrained. These are people that can't just be rehired because more training needs to be involved. They're not prepared for the work environment that they're in. And we saw this in 2009 in Indiana, for instance, my hometown. A lot of them, it's a big van conversion and trailer motor vehicles, recreational vehicles, RVs, manufacturing facilities that were there, and a lot of them went under and closed their doors. And so because the economy wasn't very diversified, you had a huge sector of the population that was unemployed, that were structurally unemployed, higher than normal. And the unemployment rate there, was above 23% when the national rate of unemployment hit 10, but in this part of the country it actually hit over twice that at least. And it's because they needed to be retrained. Those people, they weren't prepared for the workforce, the environment that they were in, and so a lot of them lost their jobs. And in a lot of cases there weren't any jobs, but the idea is even if there were, they weren't prepared to take on those jobs because they worked in factories. They didn't know any other type of work. And so structural unemployment is the need for retraining individuals, and that's usually about 3% of the overall unemployment rate. This is why zero isn't really a true or realistic reason behind striving for unemployment at zero, because you've usually got about 4% in there that is this frictional and structural in nature, people between jobs and people that need to be retrained for jobs. And that's just when you get to an economy like ours, when you have 325 million people in it, you get to a situation where you're always going to have people that are in between jobs. You're always going to have people that need to be retrained and that sort of thing. So tack on, for example, another 3%, and you get to what we call our natural rate or full employment. Natural rate of unemployment or full employment is really when LRAS. When we hit LRAS or full employment, it's about at that 7%. If you factor in, for example, another 3% on top of what we see here with frictional and structural. So for a rate below 7% is really good. And even what we have right now in the midst of this pandemic, now the numbers are slow to come out, of course, but we're still below that 7%. Now again, all of those numbers haven't come in yet. Those 16 million people haven't hit these Fred numbers that we're going to take a look at. So keep that in mind. But the idea here is full employment. Anything below 7%, we're in probably a pretty good place. Okay. Now let's look at differences in terms of structural unemployment. We have a government mandated wage. Okay, a price floor, and that is a minimum wage. The idea is that people can pay more than this, but they have to pay at least this. And in Maryland, even in Montgomery County, the wage is even higher than that. So that can cause reasons. Many economists say the higher the minimum wage, the greater you have structural unemployment issues, because of the fact that I'm looking for someone. If I'm going to pay them more above minimum wage, I'm going to expect more from them. And so there may need to be some retraining involved. There may need to be additional certifications or other types of resources that are involved here. And then unions, another reason for structural unemployment, because you're a part of a union, because we have to collectively bargain with those that bargain for you, it's going to get you higher wages. And as a result of that, when we go to make a hire, we're going to be less likely to just go ahead and hire that person, because we know we're going to have to deal with a union with every person we bring on. It's going to be harder to fire them. It's going to be harder to negotiate bargains in terms of their pay structure and their benefits and that sort of thing. And when we give it to one, we're giving it to all. So that's going to cause the price of what we're paying for each employee to rise. So a lot of structural unemployment is caused by this sort of thing when you have unions and minimum wages as a result of that. Other aspects of structural unemployment can include efficiency wages. Costco isn't a good example here. They don't pay the minimum wage. They pay above the minimum wage. But they also have an expectation that you're going to do more, that you're going to go above and beyond. And their workers do. But it's an incentive for the workers to go above and beyond, because they have better benefits, because they have better pay per hour. It's encouraging them to do more than just the minimum. And so when they go to hire, they're looking for someone that's not just going to fill the shelves and unbox things and stock the shelves. They're looking for someone who's going to look out for the business and have a bigger picture. And so they're going to hire for that. They're going to interview for that. And so if you don't have those types of skills, it's going to be harder for you to get a job. So you're going to be structurally unemployed even longer because of this sort of thing. And then anytime there's government regulations, government policies, other types of things that are stepping in, you're always going to have a gap between those that you would hire if those weren't in the way, and the higher bar that you're going to set if you're going to have to pay those individuals more, or other policies and fiery hoops you're going to have to jump through in order to keep those people and to pay those people. And maybe you're going to have to pay them additional benefits or something as a result of laws that the government passes. That's a role that it tends to lead to higher structural unemployment, because businesses are more reticent to hire because of the concerns that they're going to have to pay more out of their pocket. As a result, they want a worker that's going to do more than just the minimum. So those are some of the reasons Krugman talks about in this chapter in terms of structural unemployment and the causes for it. Now, going back to this idea of natural rate of unemployment, we kind of talked about it before as being this combination of structural and this combination of frictional, and then adding a little bit more to it in these terms. This is essentially our normal unemployment rate. Okay, when we talk about NAIRU in a little bit, I mean, this is what we're talking about, this natural rate of unemployment. Anything below that 7%, probably in a good place in terms of how this fluctuates between the cycles. Okay, and that gets into this idea of cyclical unemployment, kind of going back and forth through the business cycles, when we're in expansion, when we're in contraction, when we're at peak, when we're at trough, those types of things really having an impact here in terms of the natural rate of unemployment, because in an expansionary time, we're going to see that we're going to be doing better than the natural rate of unemployment, and we're going to see in recessionary times we're actually going to be doing probably worse than the natural rate of unemployment, and that is natural because of the business cycle, because of that deviation from the cycle. And we have a couple graphs coming up that I think will help explain that a little better. Now, why would we have changes in this natural rate? Well, we talked about a couple already. If you're in expansion versus recession, that's a big difference. But the makeup of the labor force has a role here to play as well. Maybe the labor force is changing. Maybe they're becoming more educated. Maybe they're leaving the market. You have a group of people that are leaving because a neighboring state or county has adjusted its regulations and they're paying more and their benefits are better or something like that. That can lead to a change in the labor force in those terms. The addition of different regulations and policies for the labor market, those institutions of the labor market can have an impact here as well. Government policies, as I mentioned, the regulations, the rules the businesses have to abide by can also have an impact in terms of not even just where employees are, but also where businesses set up shop. We've seen a lot of businesses move across the river over to Virginia because the laws for business owners tends to be kinder to them and less kind to the workers, and businesses have done that. And we've seen a few. And we could go on a list all day. Bechtel is a big contractor with the government, and they moved to Virginia from Maryland. And one of the reasons they cited was less regulatory burden by the state of Virginia versus the state of Maryland. It's just one good example of government policies that changed the natural rate of unemployment. Now, they did say, hey, workers, you can come with us, but if you don't want to come with us, then you're essentially out of a job. And that can cause changes. If you have enough companies do that because of government policies that are taking effect there, then that can have a real impact. That can really make a difference. And then changes in productivity, this idea of doing more with less, more technology taking over. We see a lot of computers on assembly lines assembling cars today. Now, we need people to run those computers and people to oversee that assembly line, but people on the line itself, computers have taken that over. Machines are doing the job of what people were doing. And so that's causing for changes in the natural rate of unemployment as well. And in coming back to this idea of the cyclical unemployment, this based on the business cycle, this is really where we see some fluctuations. It does tend to mirror the natural rate of unemployment, does tend to mirror the output gap, this idea of actual real GDP versus what the potential output is. And what we see is that there is a correlation, that there is a pairing of the two in terms of actual real GDP and potential GDP. And a good example of this that we see here is in unemployment, when you've got the actual unemployment rate kind of going all over the place here, and we see the peaks and the valleys, the natural rate of unemployment says, okay, well, we're up a little bit, we're down a little bit, we're up a little bit, we're down a little bit. And we can see that natural rate tends to flow even amongst all the jagged edges that we see here. And we could say the same in terms of the output gap. If you apply that then to what we see here, based on with the actual unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment, you can see the cyclical one mirrors the output gap pretty well in terms of the ebb and flow. And there's always going to be those fluctuations. There's always going to be those jagged edges, the peaks, the valleys. You're not going to get around that. But what it's important to keep in mind is that there is a general flow. And the idea is that the unemployment is tied to the business cycle. I mean, think about it. If we're in a recessionary period and the business cycle, the business cycle is recessionary, then you're going to have people that are out of work because businesses are closing. Okay. And if people are out of work, then your unemployment is going to rise. So as the business cycle, as the real GDP starts to tank, your unemployment rate is going to rise. And when you get into an expansionary period where the businesses are opening and hiring workers, then you're going to see businesses open, real GDP is growing, and unemployment will fall. So you can kind of look at that as kind of an inverse relationship to real GDP, because if you're looking at real GDP, and real GDP is going up, then your unemployment is falling. And if real GDP is going down, then your unemployment will be rising. So it is kind of an inverse relationship there. Keep in mind, you can look at this with what we called the inflationary and recessionary gaps. So if you have a positive output gap, meaning an inflationary gap, you're above full employment, then obviously your unemployment rate is going to be lower than the natural rate. Why? Because real GDP is growing. Businesses are booming. They're hiring workers to the point that we have a positive output gap, and they're going to need workers in order to help carry that out. So unemployment will be lower. When we have a negative output gap or a recessionary gap, the idea there is that businesses are closing. And if businesses are closing and real GDP is falling, then unemployment will be rising. It'll be above the natural rate because of the fact that those businesses are closing and real GDP is falling. So it really does tend to mirror in terms of what we see here. So even though we see jagged edges here and there, the natural rate of unemployment really does tend to correspond pretty well to what we see here in the cyclical unemployment, to the output gap, to the natural rate of unemployment, and the actual unemployment rate itself. So a lot of similarities. But again, if you think about it in terms of the idea here is if we're operating in recession, then we're probably have an unemployment rate that is higher than the natural rate of unemployment, and we also will have a real GDP that is falling. And that is what we see. So taking a trip down memory lane for a second, we're just going to quickly go through these statistics. But we, in looking at the recession of 2009 to take us all the way to where we are now, March 2020, we have in January 2009, we had an unemployment rate of 7.6%. Okay, we had 11.6 million people out of work. Okay, and a civilian labor force of 153 million people. Now, the labor force is going to continue to rise, but the unemployment number is really what's important here. We have 11.6 million people out of work. Now, fast forward a year later, the number is even higher. Wait a minute, I thought the government was doing something. What happened? Well, it takes time. Remember that lag we talked about when it comes to real GDP? That lag is still there. It's still going to take time to get fiscal stimulus to work, to get those lower taxes and more government spending in the market. It's going to take time when the Fed is buying bonds to grow the economy, to get things moving again. So here we actually saw unemployed go from 11 million to 16 million in just a year. The unemployment rate now 10.6%. That would be the peak. That would be the trough in terms of real GDP. But in terms of unemployment, that would be the peak unemployment rate that we would see. Because the following year, if we look at January 2011, we would see that it was falling then to 9.04% unemployment. We went from 16.1 million workers out of work in January 2010 to now 13.8 million. That we see here in January 2011. Fast forward a year later, the unemployment rate is dropping. Now it's 8.3%. We fast forward another year, we see now 7.8%. We're getting down to that natural rate now, really close. But again, that took almost 5 years to make that happen, to get back to the natural rate of unemployment. And it would be January 2014 we would see that dip below the natural rate, 6.7%. Where it was going to stay until 2020. And so you can see, even with the unemployment rate, it took time for that to take effect, to get down now to, 10 million workers that we see here. January 2015, even better, we would see 5.6% unemployment rate. January 2016, 4.9% unemployment rate. Now our unemployed is only 7.8 million, which is probably one of the best numbers that we saw since before the recession of 2008, 2009. So that's really great in terms of numbers, because the civilian labor force continues to increase. Here in 2017, we saw the unemployment rate fall to 4.7%, so even lower. In 2018, it would fall to 4.1%. 2019, it would fall to 4.0% unemployment. The number of unemployed, 6.5 million. And again, that number 4%, that's strictly frictional and structural in terms of what's happening there. So that is really no wiggle room left on that. Natural rate of unemployment is really just structural and frictional at that point. And then we get to January 2020. Our lowest, where we're at 3.6%, and again, below even what was frictional and structural. Really great. And then just fast forwarding to the latest data, which they don't have April yet, but March is looking at, we went from, 5.9 million in January, to 7.1 million, and we know that number is at around 16 million now. So double that number. We're already at probably about 8.8 or 9% in April. and we'll see how that number takes shape. So you can see kind of how that cyclical, that real cycle really took effect here, starting in going back to 2008, 2009, all the way to March of 2020. You can see how we saw the trough, we saw a recession, we saw the trough, then we saw expansion, we saw that expansionary period, we saw the peak in January, and then we're in that recessionary slide into March, and that will probably be a good part of 2020 as we go along. Now, a couple other things to talk about before we get to NAIRU is this idea of Okun's law. Krugman talks about this idea that when we have a greater real GDP, okay, when we can improve our GDP, we can actually reduce the unemployment rate, okay? For each additional percentage that we improve real GDP, and we reduce that output gap. Remember that gap between the natural rate and whatever our rate of unemployment is. We can actually reduce unemployment by less than 1%. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, and you don't need to know this formula other than that Okun's law is essentially helping to reduce unemployment. By growing GDP, you're reducing unemployment. It's not a 1-to-1, but it is having an impact. And a greater impact than, there is a lag, of course, but it is having an impact by growing real GDP, which is why Congress and the President and the Fed, everybody really, jumping in early to get this thing moving again, to restore confidence, because they really know that if you don't have GDP growing, you don't have unemployment falling. And that is going to be a real key to consumer confidence. It's going to be a key to getting consumers spending again. That's really going to have quite an impact in terms of getting the economy moving again and getting out of recession. So important, Okun's law, to really guide that. Now, why do we look at this and say, why doesn't this move faster, right? And we have this conversation all the time about things happening in the economy. And the reason is the lag, okay? We know that things aren't quick to change, and we can see this even in the March numbers we were just looking at. This, even now we know that this number is probably 16 million in the unemployed range, 16.6 or something like that. It's more than double what we see here, but we don't see it here yet, but we will. And the reason for that is because there's a lag. And we know that even when you start to use fiscal stimulus or you start to use monetary policy, those things are going to take time to take effect. Okay, and some of the reasons for why we don't see changes quickly in the labor market, obviously, are because of that Okun's law with real GDP and the changes. Businesses are going to be slower to hire. We know this. When they start to reopen, they're going to hire, but they're going to be very careful to hire only what they need and to see what they can get by with before they start, hiring all these people. They're going to hire what they need, and they're going to be bare bones for a while until they start to see the customers coming back and business improving and growing, and then they'll start to take more risks. But that's going to take time, and that could be a matter of months, that could be a matter of years in terms of making that happen. So there is reasons also behind this in terms of why the wages may be changing slowly, and looking at that from a GDP perspective ties into this idea of misperceptions. When you're slow to hire, you're also slow to pay anything more than you have to. Why? Because you're trying to get on your feet again. You're trying to pay your bills, meet your mortgage, meet your lease requirements, pay your workers, and you don't want to pay them more than necessary and end up having to close your doors as a result of it. So you're going to be much more wary, much more cautious as you start to hire than you were before. Okay, and so that means employers, they're not going to be as antsy to raise those wages when the inflationary gap hits. They're going to take their time. They're going to try they're going to try and hold out as long as they can on that type of thing. And we see this all the time, where businesses will lose people because of the fact that they didn't appreciate them and pay more right away, and they went to a competing business where they could make more money. And that really does have an impact. Menu costs, not so much anymore, but we do see that from time to time. This was also the whole idea of inflation inflation and shoe leather costs and that kind of thing. Menu costs, it doesn't cost a ton of money to reprint menus these days in terms of the sticky wages aspect, but the idea is the same, that businesses are going to be slow to adjust, and they're going to take that out on their workers, unfortunately, and that's going to lead to less hiring, and they're going to temper their actions in making that happen. Now, a couple of points about inflation while we're here. And we'll get into more of this in the next chapter. But there are two types of inflation you need to know. The first one is demand pull. This is the idea that demand, think of it as demand is essentially pulling inflation up by the bootstraps. Okay, it's basically pulling it up, and that is AD shifting to the right. Now we know AD is a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, and the idea of something, the powers that be essentially pulling it up as a result of an increase in demand, that's going to shift it to the right. You have too much money chasing too few goods, you're going to have inflation, and it's going to be demand that's pulling that inflation up, versus cost push, which is essentially your SRAS shifting inward or leftward, leading to stagflation. Stagnant wages, increasing costs. You have to pass along those costs to your customers, and so you have cost push inflation that's actually making that happen. So that's the difference there in terms of resource costs. Now, there is a Phillips curve here that we'll talk about, and a couple of these tie into this idea of inflation and unemployment. There is a relationship, at least in the short run, there is a relationship between unemployment and inflation. If you have higher inflation, chances are you have lower unemployment. If you have lower inflation, you have higher unemployment. You think about it this way: if you're in an inflationary gap, the inflation rate is higher. Why? Because everybody's working, they're being paid more than they're probably worth in that respect, and as a result, you have more money chasing fewer goods, and so you're going to have inflationary pressures, but the unemployment rate is lower. More people have jobs. Okay. In the converse, the inverse of that, you have a higher unemployment rate. You're going to have a lower inflation rate, because if people don't have jobs, they're certainly not paying more for goods that they don't need or that they can't buy right now. So that's kind of how to think about it in terms of that trade-off, and that leads to the key graph 29, which you can pause here to jot it down in your graphing notebook. There are a few here, and then I will pick it up here to talk to you a little bit more about this key graph. And hopefully you've had a chance to copy it down in your graphing notebook. Essentially, there's a trade-off here. The idea of this SRPC is that you have a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If you have higher inflation, lower unemployment. If you have higher unemployment, lower inflation. And the idea is, in the short run, there's usually a trade-off between the two. Now, having said that, we've been in an expansionary period for almost 11 years, up through, February, March. And that was really kind of a short-run Phillips curve buster, because people looked at this and said, how can you have an expansionary period in which inflation is not a problem and unemployment's not a problem either? Well, in that case, you probably have an SRPC shifting leftward because of all the government stimulus money, because of the Fed lowering rates, because of the growth in technology. There's lots of factors that can impact that, but that's essentially what we see as the idea, even though a lot of economists, again, they don't agree, never do, are saying, is it a Phillips curve buster? Well, we'll let the jury stay out on that one and move on to key graph 30, which is a graph within a graph. Do I need to copy the other graph? Yes, you do. And I'll give you a chance to copy this down, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, so taking a look at the inside graph explains a little bit more about the shift in the SRPC in the overall graph. So let's look at there first. Here we have a recessionary gap. We have an SRAS curve that is shifted leftward or inward. Price level is higher, and real GDP is obviously falling. So we're in recession. We're in stagflation, perhaps, because you have higher prices and you have stagnant wages, but you also have a real GDP that is falling. So you'd have a recessionary gap in this instance, and as a result of this, because you have higher prices, you have inflation increasing while unemployment is also increasing. That's what's going to shift the SRPC to the right, and that's what we see here in the overall graph. So SRPC shifts to SRPC1, and this short-run Phillips curve is to the right of the original curve because of the fact that you have recession, which means higher unemployment, fewer people have jobs, and you have a higher price level. So as a result of this, you can see both actually happening here. Your SRAS curve shifting to the left, which is leading to this recessionary gap and people losing their jobs, but you also have inflation to worry about. Not a good combination. And when you have supply issues that address this recessionary gap, like we talked about with Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s, that's a real problem that's hard to solve. You can't just throw more AD at it. If you try and throw government money in order to shift AD back, look what happens. You end up back at long run, but at a PL3, which is even higher than what PL2 was. So you have really big problems with inflation. Yeah, everybody's working, but their wages are worth less because of all of the price increases that you have taking shape. So that's key graph 30. Let's go to our third and final key graph of this chapter, and that is key graph 31. I'll give you a moment to copy this down, and then let me talk about it. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to copy that down. And key graph 31 is just like key graph 29. The only difference here is now we have a long-run Phillips curve, okay? We know that Keynes said in the long run we're all dead. And in the long run, when it comes to the Phillips curve, this relationship between inflation and employment, the long-run Phillips curve basically is saying that you have no relationship between the two. So in long run, you could have a lower unemployment rate, or full employment, as it may be, at long run, and you could have a higher inflation rate. You could have a lower inflation rate. It really doesn't matter because there's no connection between that unemployment rate and the inflation rate as a result of it. So when you get to this LRPC level of unemployment that is full employment, right, essentially you are at NAIRU, you are at the natural rate of unemployment, but that could be higher or lower, and the inflation rate could be higher or lower, because of the idea that there's no connection, there's no relationship between the two anymore in the long run. In the short run, we see trade-offs between the two, but in the long run, they're separate, and what they do is also separate as a result. Okay. This is an activity that I'm going to have you do 5-8 and 5-9 for the week, but do look at the answer keys on Google Classroom so you can take a look at your answers, and that way you can come to our class session to talk about what you missed and why you maybe didn't get something that didn't make a whole lot of sense here, so that we can address that and help make that happen. But do take a look at that 5-8 that we see here. A couple other slides I want to talk about before we get to the last one, which is 5-9, and then again is short run and long run Phillips curve. But we want to talk about expectations. Okay, this idea of the short run Phillips curve. If there is an expected rate of inflation that people are expecting in the future, it's kind of baked in. Okay, so it's kind of like what we talked about with the Fisher effect in looking at, and if those of you that didn't read chapter 33 yet, it will, but the idea of the Fisher effect is, well, if we've baked in expectations, we've kind of talked about it, and the market has already known that it's going to be happening, then it has less of an impact. It's less frightening because you've kind of already prepared us for what lies ahead. And that's really important because if you surprise everybody, the element of surprise is always what scares people, right? We talk about the markets, buy on the rumor, sell on the news. The whole idea is that if you've kind of shared what you think is going to happen, and as a result it actually does happen, then people are less surprised, and the element of surprise is taken away, and you're like, yeah, you told us that was going to happen, no big deal, I've already priced that in. Well, that's an important point, because if you've already priced it in, then people are going to be less shocked by the results. So that's why you see the Fed, that's why you see the White House and the Labor Secretary talk all the time about unemployment numbers and the concerns. The Treasury Secretary came out saying unemployment could reach as high as 20% or something. Why are they throwing those scary numbers out there? Because they want you to be prepared. They want you to so when the actual number comes in, like the one showing almost 10% of the people are unemployed, it's less frightening. It's less of concern. And so that baked in definitely helps. Now, it doesn't mean it solves all problems, but the idea is that it does help in that respect. So NAIRU here, this idea of non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, is essentially baking that in. This idea of looking at a rate and saying, hey, we're expecting, unemployment to essentially remain where it is, but inflation is going to rise as a result of that. Well, if you're baking that in, then people are going to be less surprised by it, and it's going to be still within that natural rate. And if it, is at that 4% that we were talking about, but inflation's, ticking up, if it jumps dramatically, then that's a different story. All bets are off. But a couple of percent, going from 2 to 4 or going from 4 to 6, a couple of percent here and there, and you put that out to the market, then they're more understanding and less surprised by it. That's always a better way to go. So again, going back to that idea, natural rate of unemployment, the NAIRU, essentially anything below that 7%, probably in a pretty good place. And you can see here, even with that 2% inflation rate, even if it were moving to 4 or later moving to 6, still the idea is the more expectations you can bake in, the better off the expectation will be, and the better off people will be less jarred by the news when it actually happens. Okay, so that really is important here in order to outline that. And again, going back to what Krugman says about the long run Phillips curve, not having a relationship, an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation in the long run. That's why it's a vertical line. That's why there's no trade-off as a result of it. And that really does have an impact there. So what we see here is, okay, we're at full employment, but we see inflation rising from 2 to 4% as a result of whatever full employment is. Not a big deal. We kind of bake that in, and it is expected as a result. So that's what we see there. All right, so that leads us to 5-9, which is another activity I would suggest you do this week. So 5-8 and 5-9, along with the take-home quiz, will help you tremendously in terms of preparing on unemployment and inflation for this chapter. And then we have one chapter left, and that is chapter 33, which we will cover as we start to move into review mode and get ready for the AP exam coming up next month. Have a great day, live the 5, and we will see you in the next and final chapter.